A black waitress got stabbed 20 times defending the K9 of a veteran. 24 hours later, 200 Navy SEALs showed up for her. The day was coming to an end and Keisha was getting ready to clock out. Little did she know something strange was about to happen to her. Outside, the diner's neon sign flickered in the rain. Inside, Keisha wiped down the last table, glancing at the clock. Nearly midnight. She was exhausted but steady, always finishing her shift with care. Earl sat in his usual booth, an old Marine with a rigid back and hard eyes, his retired K9 resting at his feet. The dog was alert despite the gray on its muzzle, always watching the door. Keisha respected them both. She learned Earl wasn't much for conversation, but he always tipped well enough, and the way he looked at that dog told her everything about the man. She called the dog handsome, offering gentle words and careful movements. He wagged once in greeting, recognizing her as safe. She grabbed the coffee pot and walked over. "Top you off?" she asked softly. Earl gave a small nod. He didn't say much, but she saw the gratitude in his eyes. Keisha loved working the late shift, even if it was tough. The diner was quiet at that hour, the few regulars like family. She needed those tips to keep her apartment and buy her boy new shoes for school. Life wasn't easy, but it was honest work. She turned to clean the counter one last time. The diner felt safe, until the door swung open. The bell above it gave its usual cheerful chime, but this time it felt wrong. A man staggered in, soaked from the rain, shoulders hunched under a battered army surplus jacket. He didn't look at Keisha, didn't look at Barry. His eyes went straight to Earl and the dog. Keisha felt her stomach clench. "Sorry, sir," she called, voice even. "We're about to close. Can I get you something to go?" He didn't answer. Instead, he mumbled something, words slurring, but there was no mistaking the venom in his tone. Barry looked up sharply. "Hey man, you hear her? We're closed." The stranger kept moving. Slow, deliberate steps toward the back booth. Earl didn't move at first, just sat there, watching. But his dog's growl was a warning low enough to feel in your bones. Keisha wiped her hands on her apron and moved around the counter. Her heart was beating faster now, every instinct screaming at her that this was wrong. "Sir, please. You need to leave," she tried again. He stopped walking. For 1 second, the diner was silent except for the rain hammering the roof. Then he smiled. It was a cold, broken smile. He said something about the dog, about it deserving what it got overseas. Keisha didn't even understand it at first. The words were jumbled, hate-soaked, but it didn't matter. His hand was inside his coat now. Earl's voice boomed, "Get out." The dog lunged against the leash, barking, teeth bared. The stranger ripped his hand from his coat. Steel flashed. A knife. Keisha didn't think. She didn't weigh consequences, didn't consider her son, her rent, the hours she'd have to cover if she got hurt. She just moved. 1 second she was behind the counter. The next she was between the man and the booth. Barry yelled. Earl was shouting. But the world shrank to the stranger's eyes, wide and crazed, in the silver glint of the knife. She raised her arms, tried to push him back. The blade punched into her side. White-hot pain. She sucked in air, tried to hold him back. Another stab, this time across her ribs. She screamed, voice cracking with shock and agony. Blood spattered the tiled floor. Barry rushed forward, but froze as the man swung the blade at him wildly. The dog barked so fiercely the windows rattled, straining at its leash until the collar dug into its neck, snarling, snapping, trying to get to Keisha. Earl was shouting, old voice ragged with terror. Keisha fell to her knees, vision going gray at the edges. She felt the knife again, her shoulder, her belly, the cold ripping her apart. She heard herself gasp, a wet, choking sound. Blood poured over her apron, soaking it deep red. Her hand pressed uselessly against one of the wounds. She heard the dog whimpering. It broke her. She twisted toward it, eyes meeting the animal's desperate, panicked gaze. "I'm sorry," she tried to say, but it came out as a croak. The stranger tried to swing again, but Earl kicked the table into him. Barry grabbed a chair and threw it. The man stumbled back, cursing, falling onto the floor. The knife clattered away. Barry tackled him. Earl dropped to his knees beside Keisha, ignoring the chaos, hands pressing against her wounds. His face was a mask of horror and helpless fury. "Stay with me," he bellowed, voice cracking. Keisha tried to focus. On Earl. On the dog, now quiet and whining, nose pressed to her arm. She was so cold. Sirens in the distance. Barry's voice, breathless and wild, screaming into the phone for help. Blood pooled around her, dark and slick, mixing with coffee-stained napkins someone had tried to use as bandages. She could hear the slap of rain against the window. Could smell the metallic tang of blood and bleach. Earl's hands were shaking. God damn it. Stay with me. Keisha blinked, tried to nod. She wanted to tell him the dog would be okay. That's all she wanted to know. The door flew open. Red and blue strobes cut through the diner. EMTs rushed in, equipment banging against door frames. Mary shouted their location. They forced Earl back. Hands pressed on her wounds. She gasped, arched, screamed. Needles. Oxygen. Voices barking orders. They lifted her onto a gurney. The dog tried to follow, barking until Earl wrapped his arms around it, burying his face in its neck. The last thing she saw before the stretcher rolled out into the storm was Earl's face, wet with tears, the dog howling. The diner, once warm and safe, now streaked with blood, chairs overturned, napkins trampled in red. The bell above the door chimed one last time as they carried her out. Outside, the rain kept falling. Sirens wailed, and Keisha's world went dark. The ambulance doors slammed shut behind her, and the rain-washed world of the diner disappeared into red and blue flashing chaos. Keisha lay strapped to the gurney, blood-soaked apron clinging to her chest and belly. Her breath rattled, eyes fluttering, rolling back as the medic's gloved hand pressed hard on the wound in her side. Stay with me, he barked, voice cracking with urgency. She tried to answer, but her mouth just worked silently, blood bubbling at her lips. The siren wailed, screaming through the night, matching the sharp, searing pain that tore through her torso with every heartbeat. BP's tanking, another medic shouted over the din. The driver's voice crackled over the radio. ETA 2 minutes. She's crashing. Her vision blurred. She saw lights, flickering and harsh, dancing across the wet windshield. She felt the weight of the mask against her face, the straps biting her cheeks. She heard the medic's voice, closer now, gentle even in his fear. Hold on. Don't you give up. You hear me. Keisha's hand twitched, bloodied fingers curling weakly before falling still. The medic's face hardened. Damn it. They hit the bay at full speed. Inside, the hospital doors flew open, crashing back against the walls. A team of nurses and doctors sprinted forward, gloved hands already outstretched. Code trauma, someone yelled. They surrounded the gurney, moving in a blur of blue and white. The medic rattled off her stats in breathless urgency. Multiple stab wounds, thorax, abdomen, shoulder, BP 60 over nothing, rapid loss, unresponsive. Her head lolled to the side. Blood streamed down her neck, soaking the collar of her uniform, dripping in fat, dark drops onto the floor. Get her into trauma 1. Move. They rushed her through double doors. Scissors flashed, slicing away her apron and shirt in rough, practiced movements. The wounds were jagged and deep, flesh laid open like raw meat. Blood pumped in slow, 6 surges. Suction. Now. A nurse pressed hard on one of the wounds, trying to stanch the flow. Keisha jerked feebly, a gurgle in her throat. Intubate. Another nurse held her head as a tube slid down her throat. Her chest heaved with mechanical breaths, the ventilator shrieking. BP 50 over palp. She's going. The lead surgeon snapped orders without blinking. Crack the thoracotomy tray. Get me on egg. Tell the blood bank we need 6 units standing by. Voices overlapped in a frenzied chorus. IVs blown. Find another line. She's hypovolemic. Cross-match, fast. Pulse is thready. Clamp here. Clamp here. A metallic clang rang out as instruments were dumped onto a tray. The team dove in, cutting deeper to find the bleeder. The overhead lights glared onto slick, crimson-washed gloves. Keisha didn't move. The monitor wailed, a high, piercing scream. Losing her. Charge the paddles. Her body arched violently as electricity coursed through her. Again. The team fought like soldiers in a losing battle. Hands pressed deep into her side, clamping vessels, sewing, patching. Blood bags drained into her arm, emptying in minutes. A nurse's face twisted with something like grief even as she worked. She's so young. Focus, the surgeon snapped. We're not losing her. Outside the operating room, the hallway was a storm of dread. Keisha's mother sat in one of the cheap plastic chairs, purse clutched so hard it seemed it might snap in half. Her eyes were dry, glassy, staring at nothing. She didn't blink, didn't speak. Keisha's sister sobbed into her own arms, rocking back and forth, her voice muffled but raw. Barry stood off to the side, still in his diner uniform. Keisha's blood spattered across the front. He'd refused to wash it off. He kept running a shaking hand through his hair, muttering to himself. She just jumped in front of him. She didn't even think. He said it over and over, as if the words themselves were a prayer or a curse. Cutaways showed the hospital staff moving with grim efficiency. A woman at the desk whispered into a phone, transferring calls to a social worker. The security guard stood watch nearby, trying not to look at the family too long. Further down the hall, Earl was a statue. The old Marine wouldn't sit, wouldn't rest. He paced a tight, relentless line in front of the doors, his face locked in that same grim, immovable scowl he wore at the diner. But his eyes betrayed him. They were wet, bloodshot. He gripped the canine's leash so tightly the old dog whined, shifting uncomfortably. The dog hadn't stopped trembling. It pressed its nose to the floor, sniffing the trail of blood that led to the doors. Every few seconds it let out a low, pained whimper, tail stiff and quivering. Earl knelt once, pulling the dog close, pressing his forehead against its broad, furred head. His jaw clenched, teeth grinding. "It's okay," he rasped, voice cracking. "It's okay, boy. She's fighting." A nurse passed by, glancing at him with soft pity before hurrying on. Inside, the surgery raged on. "Get me more Oneg. She's empty. We're losing her. Document. Clamp. Suction. You want her to die on this table? Clamp." Monitors beeped frantically. Beads of sweat ran down the surgeon's brow, soaking the edge of his mask. "Stay with me," he muttered, barely loud enough for the others to hear. Blood spattered the tray. Another nurse's gloved hands shook for just a second before she forced them steady. "She saved that man's dog," she whispered to another. "I know. She might not make it. Don't say that." Back in the waiting room, Barry covered his face with both hands. Keisha's sister gasped for air between sobs. Their mother still didn't move. And Earl just stood there, one hand buried in the dog's fur, the other clenched around the leash so hard his knuckles were white. He didn't speak, didn't pray, didn't dare hope. He just waited. Waited for the doors to open. Waited for someone to tell them whether the woman who threw herself in front of a blade for his best friend would live or die. Inside, the surgeons kept fighting. Outside, the world held its breath. At first, it was just a local news alert on a small-town website. Waitress stabbed 5 times defending retired Marine's K9. The photo was grainy but arresting. Police tape strung across the diner's neon sign, rain glistening like blood on the pavement. By dawn, it was everywhere. Local TV anchors with somber voices repeated the details. A waitress critically injured last night when she intervened in an attack. They showed stock footage of ambulances, the battered front of the diner, and a single photograph of Keisha in her work uniform, smiling at the camera, unaware of the coming nightmare. The headline crawled across the bottom of screens all over the state, "Hero waitress in critical condition." But the story didn't stay local. Somewhere, someone in uniform read the article with tightening fists. Military forums lit up. A Marine who'd once eaten at that diner posted about Keisha's smile. A Navy vet who'd seen too many good dogs die overseas shared that she'd saved one of ours. And then it hit the networks for real. National anchors said her name with quiet gravity. Keisha, a waitress working the late shift, was stabbed 5 times while shielding a retired K9. The detail that hooked the nation was simple and true. She never even hesitated. In private groups, retired SEALs messaged each other. "You see this? This girl's family now. We can't just sit around." By midnight, the word had spread through a brotherhood bound by silence and sacrifice. Text chains buzzed. Rolling out. "Who's in? Be there by dawn." They came from hours away. Trucks and SUVs rumbled down highways in the dark. At gas stations along I-95, men with shaved heads and military caps nodded at each other without words, filling up tanks and grabbing coffee. Some wore faded t-shirts with unit logos. Others wore clean-collared shirts, business clothes they'd peeled off after leaving work without asking permission. It didn't matter. They were going. Because there was a rule older than any written order: leave no one behind. By the time the sun rose, over 200 Navy SEALs, active duty and retired, stood in silent ranks at the hospital. They lined the walls, eyes watchful, arms folded, boots planted like they were on guard duty in a war zone. Doctors and nurses slipped past quietly, glancing at them with wide eyes. Visitors paused to whisper, uncertain but moved. Some of the SEALs lowered their heads in silent prayer. Others just stared straight ahead, jaws tight. A local reporter tried to ask questions, but one SEAL simply shook his head and said, "We're here for her. That's all." The camera panned over their faces, resolute but pained. A voiceover might say, They never met her, but they knew what she'd done. She'd saved a battle buddy, so they came to save her. In that hallway, in that moment, there was no rank, no difference between past and present, just family, and they would not leave her behind. Inside the hospital, the atmosphere was heavy with silence and respect. The halls, usually bustling with staff and visitors, were lined with men in uniform and civilian clothes standing shoulder to shoulder. They weren't talking. They weren't fidgeting. They just stood in silent watch. Over 200 Navy SEALs, past and present, their expressions carved from stone. Nurses paused as they moved from room to room, exchanging quiet, odd glances. Some whispered to each other, shaking their heads in disbelief. A veteran charge nurse, decades on the job, admitted softly to a reporter, "I've never seen anything like this." Not once. Keisha's family sat in the waiting area, overwhelmed. Her mother clutched her purse in her lap, eyes swollen but dry, staring at the floor. Her sister leaned into her shoulder, quietly crying. Barry, the coworker who'd called 911, sat at the end of the row, blood still staining the hem of his apron, unable to look anyone in the eye. Beyond them, the SEALs kept arriving. Some wore crisp dress uniforms, medals pinned proudly to their chests. Others came in jeans and worn jackets, hair cut short or grown shaggy since retirement. But it didn't matter. They all stood the same way, straight-backed, arms folded, eyes forward. No orders had been given. No one had told them they had to be there. They simply came. Word had spread through military forums, text chains, old friendships. She saved a Marine's dog. She took 5 stab wounds for him. That was enough. The donations started coming in before the sun rose. Vases of flowers filled the reception desk, every color and size imaginable. Cards poured in from people she'd never met, filled with words like hero, bravery, family. Envelopes stuffed with cash arrived from veteran groups and local businesses, quietly handed to the hospital billing office with instructions to put this toward her recovery. At Keisha's bedside, it was even more personal. Challenge coins glittered in a neat stack on the rolling tray beside her monitors. Unit patches lay folded carefully next to them, stitched emblems of SEAL teams from every generation. Each coin, each patch, a promise. A sign of respect not given lightly. The old Marine visited daily, limping slightly as he settled in the hard plastic chair beside her bed. He rarely spoke, just sat there with his eyes on her pale face, hand resting on his canine's head. The dog never left her side, muzzle pressed to the sheets, ears flicking at every beep and hiss of the machines keeping her alive. A reporter asked one of the SEALs why they had all come. He took a slow breath before answering. "She's family now," he said simply. No one needed him to say more. Because in that hallway, crowded with silent warriors and filled with the scent of fresh flowers, there was no doubt about it. They weren't leaving her behind. Keisha woke slowly, as if surfacing from deep water she wasn't sure she'd ever escape. Light stabbed at her eyes even through heavy lids. She heard beeping first, steady, insistent, unfamiliar. She tried to shift, but felt a stab of pain so sharp she whimpered, breath hitching in her throat. Her eyelids fluttered. Shapes blurred and sharpened. White walls. Harsh fluorescent lights overhead. Tubes snaked from her arms, tape pinning 4 lines to fragile skin mottled with bruises. A clear plastic oxygen tube looped under her nose. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, or why she hurt so much. Her heart skittered in panic. Machines responded with a rising alarm. She tried to move again, but her body felt leaden, each breath ragged and thin. Her vision cleared enough to see a nurse rushing in. "Easy, easy, honey, don't fight it." The voice was calm, but firm. Hands pressed gently on her shoulders to keep her from straining. "Where?" she croaked. Her lips were cracked, her throat dry as dust. "Shoo," the nurse soothed, brushing sweaty hair from her forehead. "You're at Satan's hospital. You're safe. You're okay now." Keisha blinked hard, tears leaking from the corners of her eyes. She couldn't remember everything. She remembered the diner, the man's eyes, the knife flashing, the dog barking. She remembered pain. And then, nothing. Her breathing turned to sobs. A second nurse appeared at the door, ushering in her family. Her mother nearly collapsed at her side, clutching her hand and pressing it to her cheek. "Oh, baby," she cried, voice trembling. "Oh, my sweet baby. I thought I lost you." Her sister hovered just behind, face wet with tears, both hands clamped over her mouth as she tried to muffle her sobs. Keisha tried to speak, but couldn't find the words. Her mouth worked silently, cracked lips trembling. "Water," she whispered hoarsely. The nurse pressed a cup with a straw to her lips, cautioning her to sip slowly. Even that hurt. She winced with each swallow, the cool water burning down her raw throat. When she lowered her head back onto the pillow, she finally saw them. The door was open just a crack, and in the hallway beyond stood row after row of silent men. Some wore uniforms. Others were in jeans and t-shirts, arms folded across broad chests, tattoos peeking from sleeves. Navy SEALs. Dozens of them. Maybe more. All there. For her. She blinked in confusion, turning to the nurse. Why? Who are they? The nurse smiled sadly. They're here for you, honey. Been here since you came in. Keisha tried to process that, mind fuzzy from painkillers and blood loss. Why? She croaked again. They heard what you did, the nurse said softly. They said you're family now. Keisha's chest heaved as she tried to hold back sobs. Tears rolled freely into her hair. The SEALs didn't speak. They didn't move. But they watched. Silent. Respectful. Unwavering. And then she saw him. Earl. The old Marine stood just outside her door, ramrod straight despite the cane at his side. His face was carved from granite, eyes red but steady. And beside him, head resting on the edge of her hospital bed, was the dog. The canine's ears perked up at the sound of her breath catching. His big brown eyes locked on hers, unblinking. He let out a soft whine, as if even he had been holding his breath for days. Keisha let out a strangled sob. She tried to lift a hand, but it shook too badly. The dog pushed forward an inch, careful, muzzle resting fully on the sheet near her hip. His tail thumped once, tentative, gentle, as if he knew how fragile she was. Earl didn't move, but he gave the smallest nod. Ma'am, he said, voice cracking like old wood. You did good. That was all. And that was everything. Her mother was crying openly now, clutching Keisha's hand to her chest. Her sister finally found her voice, choking on words. You scared us to death, she whispered, pressing a kiss to Keisha's temple. Don't you ever do that again. Keisha tried to laugh, but it came out as a pained wheeze. She turned her gaze back to the hallway. The SEALs stood shoulder to shoulder. Some had tears in their eyes. One rested a hand on another's shoulder, comforting without words. A reporter, filming just outside, zoomed in on their faces. When he asked one of them why they came, the man turned, jaw tight, voice low and certain. She's family now, he said. Inside the room, the doctor arrived, checking her monitors with brisk efficiency but eyes warm with relief. You gave us a hell of a fight, he said gently. Most people wouldn't have survived. But you're stubborn, huh? Keisha blinked slowly, trying to smile. You'll be here a while, he continued, voice turning solemn. You've got a long road ahead. Rehab. More surgeries. Pain management. He squeezed her hand gently, careful not to disturb the foreline. But you're a miracle, Keisha. Don't forget that. She swallowed, wincing at the rawness in her throat. Thank you, she rasped. The doctor shook his head. No, he said, glancing at the crowd outside her door. Thank you. He turned to leave, giving the family space. Keisha's eyes found the dog again. He whined softly, shifting his weight so more of his head pressed against her side. She managed to move her fingers just enough to brush his fur. Good boy, she whispered. The machine beside her beeped a steady rhythm, matching the slowing of her breathing as she settled, exhausted but alive. The hallway remained full, warriors refusing to leave, a silent honor guard for a woman who had stood for one of theirs. And though Keisha could barely stay awake, her heart swelled with something beyond pain or fear. She wasn't alone. She never would be again, because she'd risked everything for someone else's battle buddy, and found hundreds who would fight for her forever. Keisha's recovery was the hardest journey she had ever faced. Each day in the hospital was a battle. Her wounds ached constantly, stitched tight and angry across her ribs and shoulder. She struggled to sit up without gasping in pain, and simple movements felt like marathons. Nurses helped her bathe, change, and even feed herself on the worst days. She hated needing so much help, but they treated her like family, encouraging her in gentle voices. The physical therapy was relentless. Each session left her exhausted and shaking, but she refused to quit. When her therapist urged her to take a break, she shook her head stubbornly. She knew she couldn't give up. Not now. Not after everything everyone had done for her. The staff knew her story intimately. They'd been there the night she was wheeled in, barely clinging to life, her blood smearing the gurney and the floor. They watched her flatline once on the table and heard the surgeon swear under his breath before bringing her back. They'd seen her fight then, and now they saw her fight again. Outside her hospital room, the world was changing too. Her story spread, first through local news outlets, then statewide, then nationally. Waitress stabbed 5 times saving Marine's service dog, made for a headline that tugged at people's hearts. News channels played footage of the rain-slicked diner lit by police lights, the blood-stained floors inside, and the small-town hospital where she now lay recovering. But the coverage wasn't just grim. It also showed the lines of Navy SEALs who had filled the hospital halls. Their silent vigil had moved viewers around the world. Reporters captured them standing in uniform or plain clothes, arms folded or hands clasped, eyes locked on the ICU doors, refusing to leave until they knew she was safe. When asked why, they all said the same thing: she's family now. That line became a rallying cry. Donations began trickling in immediately. Small bills from local folks slipped into coffee cans at the diner, checks mailed in from nearby towns. Then they started arriving from everywhere. Veterans groups organized benefit dinners. Churches passed the plate twice. Schools held car washes and bake sales with signs that said, "For Keisha." The diner where she worked turned into an impromptu shrine, its windows filled with photos of Keisha smiling in her uniform, surrounded by bouquets and thank you notes. Her co-worker Barry, who'd called 911 that night, kept the place running with help from volunteers. Every day, he wiped down the counter next to a donation jar stuffed with cash. When reporters asked why he didn't keep any for himself, he just shook his head. She didn't even think twice about saving someone else. I won't think twice about helping her. The SEALs did more than keep vigil. They made calls, sent emails, reached out to their old units and networks across the country. Word spread through military forums and social media. Even celebrities started tweeting links to her GoFundMe page. TV personalities did emotional segments about her bravery. Within weeks, the fund hit a staggering $2 million. When they told Keisha, she cried so hard she couldn't speak. She covered her face with her hands as the nurse gently rubbed her back. $2 million. Enough to pay every cent of her hospital bills. Enough to cover physical therapy, counseling, anything she'd need to heal. Enough to save the diner she loved so much. Enough to change her son's future forever. The day of her release was nothing short of a celebration. Hospital staff lined the hallway, clapping as she was wheeled past in a chair adorned with flowers. Nurses who had cared for her wiped tears from their eyes, smiling and waving. Her mother walked beside her, holding her hand tightly, squeezing it whenever Keisha's lip trembled. Outside, dozens of SEALs stood at attention. Some were in full dress uniform, medals shining in the morning sun. Others wore neat, civilian clothes, arms folded solemnly across broad chests. They saluted in unison as the doors opened and Keisha emerged. She wore a simple, pale blue dress someone had gifted her. Her hair was combed back carefully, her face pale but glowing. Tears ran down her cheeks as she raised her hand to wave back at them. Earl was there too. He borrowed a suit that didn't fit quite right and shined his old service boots until they gleamed. He leaned on his cane, face stony as ever but eyes soft with emotion. At his side sat his canine partner, tail thumping wildly as Keisha approached. The dog barked once, sharp and happy, before pressing its muzzle insistently into her lap. She laughed through her tears, one hand going to scratch behind his ears. "Hey, handsome," she whispered hoarsely. "Missed you too." Earl cleared his throat, looking anywhere but her face, before finally muttering, "About time you got out here." Reporters filmed it all, the SEALs saluting, the K-9 refusing to leave her side, her family clustered close. It was broadcast on news stations that night under the headline, "Hero Comes Home." But the community wasn't done celebrating her. A week later, they held a benefit dinner in her honor at the town's biggest hall. Banners reading, "Welcome home, Keisha," and "Thank you, hero," hung above the tables. Locals cooked barbecue and pies and sweet tea in mason jars. A country band played quietly in the corner. Barry gave a speech but had to pause halfway through to wipe his eyes. The mayor choked on his words too, promising to help with whatever Keisha needed to reopen the diner. Earl stood stiffly at the microphone. He wasn't much for speeches. He looked down at the floor and said, voice cracking once, but holding firm, she didn't have to do it. But she did. For me. For him. For all of us. The K-9 barked once in approval, making the whole room laugh through tears. When Keisha finally spoke, the hall went silent. She sat in her wheelchair, the dog resting his head in her lap, one of her hands tangled in his fur. She looked around at faces she knew so well, and some she'd never seen before. "Thank you," she whispered, voice raw but sure. "For everything. I don't know why you did all this for me. but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to deserve it." The room erupted in applause. In that moment, surrounded by family, friends, and complete strangers who refused to be strangers anymore, Keisha knew her life had changed forever. Because of one moment of instinctive bravery, she'd lost blood and nearly lost her life, but she gained a family bigger than she could have ever dreamed. If you enjoyed Keisha's inspiring story with Earl and his loyal K9, please like, share, and subscribe. Tell us your thoughts on how it all ended. Rate the story out of 10. Drop where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your reflections and connect with you.